Hi everyone and welcome to another painting tutorial from Promethean Paints. Today we're going to be painting the Chaos Space Marines Red Corsairs Reave-Captain. Also painting on this a bit that we got from Deadly Print Studios. You can either buy the STLs or you can buy the bits directly from them for some little slave guy that's been sort of imprisoned by our Reave-Captain. The design I went for was the one that's on the right hand side there. But that's sort of what we're doing here. You could use it across the other models in the range, including other Chaos Space Marines as well, especially around like the black armor and the red armor we could use. So I did just some sub-assemblies. I've got the main body, then I've got the head separate, and then the base with the little slave guy. The base is only half base because obviously the Reave-Captain is stood on like a bit of older rubble. So I only filled it with half. So to get started, we're going to be doing the red base, red armor first. And for this, I'm using a base coat of AK Black Red, which is like a corn red if you're using the Warhammer range. It's a very, very dark red colour, but still has a good red pigment in it. And it's really good coverage as well. 1 or 2 coats is all you need. And just very carefully now, just any areas you want red, just base coat with your AK Black Red. A couple of coats you could use if you've watered it down a bit too heavily, but it only needs a little drop of water on the wet palette to get this flowing really nicely. Try and keep into the areas if you can, just to reduce any other work. You know, if you're just starting from here, you sort of base coat your model in a sort of matte black primer sort of colour. Any very, very dark colour is handy because we are going for quite a dark finish on this guy, some dark shadows and some bright brights. So I've used Army Painter's matte black as the primer base for this, but sort of Chaos Black sprays would be good, or a dark grey if you wanted to. If you do make a mistake, don't worry, just go over it in your prime colour again just to fill it back in. I will also say throughout this video, if you hear any odd noises in the background from my recordings of the narration, it is one of the hottest days in the UK at the moment. For springtime, it's in mid-30s, so all the windows are open. It is mega hot. So yeah, people are having barbecues and having fun outside whilst I do the narration on this. It was actually quite warm when I was painting this model. The wet palette was drying out, so under the sort of light bulbs I'm using, so it was quite warm. It is something to remember when you're painting models, the temperature. Sometimes you need to thin your paints a little bit more because they do dry out a bit quicker in the heat. If it's humid, they can be they stay wet for quite a while, but in any dry heat, or if you've got fans blowing, they will dry out a little bit quicker. What I try and do when base coating the red, as you can see here around his hands and fist and where the red armor is overlapped by other materials, is leave a bit of that black in the recesses to save you having to do any shading with it later. You get that natural black in the shadows. Don't worry if you don't, you can always use a little bit of Nuln Oil. But sometimes even if you just do one thin coat there and then 2 coats everywhere else, you get that natural transition from the shadows to the light areas. Okay, with your base coating done of the first layer with that black red, we're now going to pure white, and then we're going to be going over the top of that with some of Ionic's red colour. Now the idea here is I want to go from very dark red to the mid-tone black red up to a very bright white. So I used bright red, sorry. So I used the AK Intense White as a way to really make the red pop in certain areas. So to achieve this, imagine where your highlights are going to be. Your highlights could be, you know, a couple of millimeters in width or depth. Just imagine where your highlight will be, and then the white that you're adding will be in the very center part of your highlight, and then when we apply the red, we'll be going either side of the white, so that you get a natural transition from the dark to the bright. So all I'm doing here is I'm imagining where my highlights are going to be, and then applying the white paint, which is slightly thinned down, into the very center points of those highlights. So once you've done that with your white paint, as you can see there, I've done these general highlights, a little bit of edge highlighting here and there. I was also imagining that the sunlight was coming down from the sort of top left of the Reave-Captain. I've now moved on and I'm using the Ionic Red, which is a really nice intense red colour from the Ionic range. But a Mephiston Red, Evil Sun Scarlet, any bright red that you've got would equally work just as well. I just use this Ionic Red because even with it watered down slightly, which I'm doing here, it's probably about a 50-50 mix of paint to water. It's still got really good coverage. So what I'm doing now is, as you can see, I've watered the paint down on the wet palette. I say 50-50, so a drop of paint, a little drop of water, just to mix it well, and so that it doesn't form a glaze, but the paint is nicely thin, so that we can get a nice effect when we're moving the paint away from the black red and into the center points of the white that we've just painted. So now we're going to try and get that transition. So remembering, when you apply paint by your paintbrush, wherever you leave the model from your paintbrush, so as you're dragging the paint along, where you remove your paintbrush is where the most paint is going to be left. So with this, I'm moving the paintbrush from the darker area into the lighter area, so that we get a natural transition from the dark red up into the bright red. And then I'm just working around the model, making sure to paint in those white areas that I've got, moving the paint in accordance with where the white is. So if it's the white here at the top of the fingers, just applying little bits, then applying the paint downwards on this sort of top hand part, then moving the paint towards the center where he's got his wrist guard, his arm guard there. A little bit of practice here is needed. If you find you've lost a little bit of the transition from the red to the dark red, then you can just thin down some of your original dark red colour and glaze it on the other direction, so moving away from your highlights back into your dark areas. It takes a little bit of time and 2 or 3 coats are needed, just dependent on how thin the paint is and how much transition you want from your dark areas to your light areas. But all I'm doing here, as you can see, is just working around the model, clearing up those transitions and just making sure we've got some really nice dark red areas and some really nice bright red areas. In previous videos, obviously I've used the airbrush to get this kind of effect where you use the white ink to go over the areas of the armor, and then using any sort of reddish ink color. I use Vallejo red ink to get that, but for this one I wanted to show that it can be done with brush work. It takes a little bit longer, but you do get a nice effect. You also get quite a worn armor effect when you're doing this as well. The armor looks really old. So what I'm doing now is just to intensify the shadows. I'm using some Warhammer Nuln Oil, applying a little bit on the brush, and then I'm just, like we were doing with the getting the highlights, to get the shadows, I'm just pushing the Nuln Oil into those darkest areas and just intensifying the transition from the bright red to the dark red, so that we get some almost black into the deepest shadows. Now we're just going to finish highlighting the red, and for this I'm using Cadian Fleshtone, but you could use sort of any very sort of pale flesh colour, like a sickly red or a Vallejo brown rose that you can use. I thinned this down quite heavily, so that's probably more 70-30 mix in favour of water. And with this I'm doing an edge highlight, making sure that I definitely highlight the areas that are brighter with an edge highlight. And then I'm just adding with my brush scratches and scrapes, just to show the armor's a little bit worn, a little bit battle damaged. I'm using a Kolinsky Sable brush. It's a Raphael Series 8404, and this is a size 0 brush. You can get a size 00, so it's even thinner, but I find the size 0 is a good all-rounder because it keeps a good sharp point. You get a good amount of paint on the brush, a bit more control. For base coating, I would use their size 1 or their size 2. But for a lot of fine work, even really fine work, the size 0 is perfect. The 00, I find the paint can dry a little bit too much on the brush, where it can't hold as much. It doesn't keep as fine a point, and the point can wear quite quickly. so that's the red armour done. We're now moving on to our first non-metallics, and for that we're going to be doing the sort of black of the armour to sort of give it a metallic-y dull look. So as you can see in this top part, I've already given it a go, and all I'm using here at first is the AK Dark Sea Blue to apply our first layered highlight for our black armour. So like we did with the black red, where we were, the black red was like a base coat for our red. This black armour's already got its base coat, which is the Army Painter's matte black. We're now applying our first highlight, which will be the AK Dark Sea Blue. So imagine where you want your highlight, and this Dark Sea Blue is the larger portion of that highlight. So where if you wanted like his wrist area there to have a highlight on it, then I've painted about 3/4 of it. So this is all personal preference. Just remember where you want your light to be on the model, shining down from, then apply the AK Dark Sea Blue. It's a very, very subtle difference between the black and the Dark Sea Blue. You can see it here. It's a really, really dark, intense blue with a hint of grey into it, so it works well as an initial highlight for black armour. If you didn't want to do this, you could just edge highlight it with the Dark Sea Blue and apply the other colours we're going to use to just intensify your edge highlights. But I sometimes find with black armour, adding in these intense bits of colours show that the armour is reflecting some ambience from other light sources. So now I'm going to be moving on to some Basalt Grey from Vallejo. And this Basalt Grey is now quite an intense colour, so you have to be careful with it. It is quite heavily thinned down, about 70-30 to water to paint. So a couple of drops of paint to 1 drop of water. And with the Basalt Grey, it is going to be your edge highlight, and it's an opportunity to add in little scratches and scrapes, pick out any of the points that you want to be slightly brighter on the black armour, but it's mostly done for your edge highlighting and to add any battle damage. If there's any rivets, you can pick out the little rivets, any raised areas. You can just add in some scratches and scrapes just to show some further wear and tear on the armour itself. now what I'm doing is to the Basalt Grey, I'm adding a little drop of white so that you get a nice lighter grey. It's almost desaturated grey, not silver. It doesn't make the paint look like a silvery type colour, but it just is a lighter version of the Basalt Grey. And this is just a thinner edge highlight now, covering a smaller area than we did previously, and just making sure that this lighter colour fills in the centre points of where you want your highlights to be. Just picking out anywhere where you want that highlight, primarily, as I said, used as an edge highlight. So we've gone from dark sea blue to Basalt Grey, and then about a 50-50 mix of white to Basalt Grey. And if you want, you can add just a little bit more white to it and push that highlight a little bit further. So there we've got a nice sort of finish to our black armour. What I've done now is I want to do some non-metallic silver, which mainly for sort of, and I wanted this to look slightly different to the black armour that we've got. So what I've done is anything that I want to be silver, I have base coated in AK Tenebrous Grey. I then do an edge highlight of the Tenebrous Grey with the Basalt Grey that we've used previously. So on these, the armour panels on his legs, it's an edge highlight in the front, in the sort of whole part of it. So you've got the edge and then the inner edge and then the sort of rivet marks as well, picking those out. But yeah, anything you want to be silver, we base coat in the Tenebrous Grey and then do an edge highlight with the Basalt Grey. There's also, I apply this, the silver is on his leg armour. There's a couple of hooks on this around his leather areas and around his chest, and then it's almost in a way just an edge highlight and around the backpack, which has got the skull and stuff on it. I didn't want that to be gold, I wanted that to be silver. So it's just an edge highlight, picking out any areas that would really catch the sun with a little bit more. But I wanted the non-metallic metal on this Reave-Captain to look worn. I wanted the silver to be really heavily used and abused. I wanted the gold to stand out, but primarily the goal here was to make the red stand out more than anything, as well as the power weapons. I wanted the metallics on the model to look quite worn, which is why just doing edge highlights and scrapes and scratches with this Basalt Grey really helps sell that it's almost like a black steel type colour, not a very shiny chrome finish. So instead of adding white to our Basalt Grey, like we did with our black armour, I wanted this to look slightly different, so I'm using some Vallejo Silver Grey. And this is thinned down again, 50-50 mix, water to the Silver Grey, but not mixed in with the Basalt Grey. This is straight out of the pot. And this is just a smaller edge highlight, just to emphasise that the light is catching and glinting, picking out any of the sort of raised areas of the sort of fist, on the armor panels, just bearing in mind where you want the light to be catching. So don't do this highlight all over, just apply it to the areas where you want to be most brightest for your metallics. So always the sort of top left hand edges, picking out your edge highlights and a few key points. You can add a little bit of scratches with this as well, just to show a little bit of battle damage, but like I say, don't apply too much, just enough to highlight those key areas. If you put this highlight over everything, then it's not a highlight. it wouldn't sort of pick out anything. If you wanted to, over the this part of the backpack where all the spikes are and that, you could just dry brush this with those two colours. Heavy dry brush with the Basalt Grey, then a lighter dry brush with this Silver Grey to get a nice metallic finish as well. And that is the two very dark non-metallic metals for silver and black armor. We're now going to be moving over to non-metallic gold. So for this, the first colour that we're going to use is from the Vallejo model colour range. It's Flat Earth. Again, anything gold I've base coated in Tenebrous Grey, but I'm going to still paint everything that I want gold with a base coat of this Vallejo Flat Earth. So just go around the model, picking out any gold areas and then base coating them with this. This is a very sort of, it's more brown than a reddish brown. You could use Warhammer Rhinox hide as the colour for this. Any of their dark browns that they've got. I just find this Flat Earth recently it's just been a nice, it's not too dark. I didn't want the gold to be really, really dark. I just wash in a little bit later to get it a little bit darker. But I wanted the sort of base coat to be slightly brighter than normal, just to make the gold stand out a little bit. So once you've finished base coating all of the gold, I then use the very aptly named Vallejo Gold Brown, which is a really nice mid-tone, and as the name suggests, it's a very brownish colour with a golden hue to it. I find this is a nice colour to work with, because actually to get these non-metallic metal finishes, especially on a Chaos Space Marine where you want it looking a bit worn and beaten, and you're not too fussed about getting really great blends between the darkness and the light, you can almost edge highlight and put in your highlights straight out with this gold brown colour over the flat earth. It is thinned down about 50-50 again, just so that you get a little bit of translucency as you're painting. But all I'm doing here is just picking out now where I want the gold to be its brightest point. So this gold brown acts as your first highlight, so it's the largest highlight. So imagine where you want your biggest bright point to be, and this gold brown is used over a slightly larger area than that, just to get some transition from your darkest points to your lightest points. This is also the first time you have to edge highlight pretty much everything that you want to be gold with this gold brown colour, because our next colour will be an even smaller highlight, and then the highlights get smaller and smaller, so this acts as your primary edge highlight colour. So once you've done that, we're already getting quite a nice golden effect on the armour. We're now going to jump up and use some Vallejo flat yellow. And with this is going to be our first bright point. And I'm just going to go around now and do an edge highlight, probably covering 3/4 of what we highlighted with the gold brown colour, and filling in any areas where I want that highlight to be really, really bright. I'm quite haphazard with the brush strokes. As you can see, scrapes and scratches are just adding texture to the model. Don't have to worry about having really, really neat transitions. A few scratches, lines and marks here and there help the blend, and it also helps sell that the armour's a little bit battle damaged. So we're going to be going from our flat earth colour with everything edge highlighted with gold brown and filled in some areas where we want our highlight to be, and then a smaller edge highlight and smaller highlight within the gold brown to start getting our bright points with the flat yellow. We're almost at pure white now. We're going to be using AK Ice Yellow. This is where I imagine now the gold is glinting, where the sun is. This is what's sort of catching the sunlight directly. So these are very, very small highlights within our yellow highlight, so even smaller. Because if you use too much of this, you'll almost desaturate everything and it'll be too much of a highlight, and then the highlight itself will just disappear. So very, very small edge highlight, and just pick out the center points of where that flat yellow is. You could also, if you don't want to, you can leave some of the flat yellow as your main highlight, and just use this ice yellow very sparingly, as I'm sort of doing here, so that in some areas the flat yellow is your biggest highlight. So what I'm just doing here now is I've got some AK Tenebrous Grey on the wet palette, and I've heavily watered it down until it's pretty much a wash. And I apply a little bit to the brush, and I'm just going around now and just making sure that I dab a little bit over the rivet marks, so that you get like you would with Nuln Oil, so that you get a nice dark area around the sort of rivets. And I'm just gently pushing the paint into the deepest recesses, just so that we get a nice transition now from our that flat earth colour down into this even flatter, darker colour. We don't want to use pure Tenebrous Grey, but I'm just adding it as a wash, just to get a little bit of different colourage on the model, and it just helps sell the darkness of the shadows. Tenebrous Grey is a very dark grey purple, so it adds just a little bit of difference to your gold if you're using it as a wash over the top. You could just use Rhinox hide for this if you wanted to. Again, heavily watered down, or you could just use a wash like Nuln Oil or Agrax Earthshade. Just make sure it's watered down enough that it doesn't destroy your highlights or your edge highlights. So that is all of the non-metallic areas done. It's all the black armor, his red armor, the silver, and the gold is all pretty much done. We're now going to move on to the next largest section, which is a lot of the leather work that's on the Reave-Captain, which is the sort of belt, the leather strap around his chest, the gun pouches. Yeah, quite a bit of leather on him. And so for this, I do a base coat of AK Grim Brown. I also apply this over the skulls with this AK Grim Brown. It's just a nice base colour. It's a very dusty colour as well. We're going to be covering most of this Grim Brown with other colours, but it's just a nice, very, very dark reddish greyish brown that gives a nice shadow colour as well for when we transition into our brighter highlights. So yeah, it's all the leather plus any of the skulls. Once we've base coated everything, we then move on to AK Leather Brown, and for this I'm covering about 90% of the Grim Brown that we've just done with this Leather Brown colour, including the skulls. This is our first opportunity to add in a few scratches and scraps, our texture that we love to add, but just make sure you leave just the Grim Brown in the deepest recesses, making sure you cover pretty much a majority of it with the leather brown. For the skulls, obviously this is our opportunity to add our first highlighting around the eyes, the nose, the teeth, as a majority of it is covered in the leather brown, which is another nice dusty colour. So once that's done, this is when we move away now from highlighting any skulls. We're actually just going to focus on the actual leather itself. And I'm going to be using AK Saddle Brown, which is a nice reddish pinkish brown. And for this saddle brown, we will be applying it as primarily an edge highlight, but also filling in any areas, sort of flatter areas, using the paint to bring out any texture marks that we want to. If there's texture already on the model, where they've modelled it on any of the leather, then pick it out with this saddle brown. But our main goal here is to do an edge highlight and to pick out any of the details or add any scrapes and scratches that we want to, but don't use this on the skulls. And then with an even smaller highlight, we just apply some Cadian Fleshtone. This is again an edge highlight, not covering the same amount that we did previously, just a smaller area, but again adding in some lines, some scratches, just to show that this leather is heavily worn. And with that, the leather is done. A few simple steps. We're now just going to finish off the skulls, and for this we use AK Mud Brown, AK Light Earth, and then AK Deck Tan. These are the sort of Xandri Dusts, use Shabti Bone, Steel Legion Drab, those sorts of colours from the Warhammer range will work just as well. But I like the colours here. I use these colours for a variety of other tasks as well, especially on the basing side of things, and I just find they're nice and dusty sort of colours, and they work really well just to get some good skull effects on these models. So first off is the mud brown, picking out the highlights of the eyes, the nose, the teeth, any holes in the skulls, just making sure we highlight around those as well. Then with the light earth, I do a little mix of 50-50 between the mud brown and the light earth because it is quite a jump up, and then just use that as a smaller highlight over the skulls. And then we move to just pure light earth and a little bit of deck tan. There's a very small highlight on some of these, on some of the skulls where the light would just catch it or it's most heavily worn. And yeah, so that's how we get our skulls painted up. Here we're just using that mud brown light earth mix, and you can already see you're getting a nice bright dusty look, adding highlights into those center points of our main highlight, making it look like not only the sun is shining down on them, but they are also heavily worn and turning white. A key thing to remember also when we're painting with acrylics, I've mentioned this in some of our other videos, is that sometimes your highlight can look really bright on the model, but it can darken down because that's the water leaving. The water reflects the light, so the highlight looks really bright. So sometimes if the highlight looks too bright, stop, let it dry and see what it looks like. And then if you like it, you can just carry on knowing that it will dry back. So that's the leather and the skulls done. We're now just going to move over to the fur, and for this I use AK Beast Brown. So the fur has been base coated with Tenebrous Grey, and then I pick out all the major fur here with the AK Beast Brown, which is a orangey brown colour. Rhinox hide, from the Warhammer range is good. There's a few reddish browns that they offer. Mornfang brown, it's another really good colour from the Warhammer range. So you take a bit of care when you're applying this beast brown. We are near some of those other areas that we've finished off. There's a reason why I didn't fit the head as well, is because the head would have blocked some of the fur that you can see behind the sort of neck area. So with all the areas covered with the beast brown, to do a mix, I use some of the, let's move my wet palette into focus here. The beast brown is on the wet palette, and I just mix in some of the Vallejo gold brown that we were using for the non-metallic gold. I mix that in, it's probably about 50-50 mix as our first highlight, and then add in more gold brown the more I want to push the highlight. I don't want to push it very far. I don't want this to really stand out. I wanted the fur to be quite dirty and old, so I just keep the highlight just probably to about a 70-30 mix of that gold brown to beast brown. If you wanted to push it even further, just add more. Then if you wanted to go even brighter, you could add in some ice yellow into that, but you just need to be careful that it doesn't go too bright and is brighter than your gold. One thing when you're painting, if everything's got too much of a highlight, then there isn't really a highlight. It all sort of blends into the same thing. And I always imagine metallics to be some of the brightest points on a model, unless you've got fire or like we have a plasma glow or something like that. So if you try and keep your highlight, your brightest points to your metallic areas, that's why I do those first. So with the fur done, we're now just going to finish off the cloak, and it's been base coated. I still think this is still as the black. Yeah, so I've not used Tenebrous Grey, I've just kept it as black, and I'm just painting the entirety of the cloak with AK Dragon Blood. It's a really nice deep purple with a hint of red there. It's got pretty good coverage. It is rather thin, so you might need 2 coats, but I don't mind its translucency because it tends to then let the shadow still go through. But if you wanted it pure, you'd probably need 2 or 3 coats of this, and I do the inside and the outside of the cloak. This will also act, this dragon blood colour will be the colour in the deepest recesses, so this is our darkest colour. And all we're going to do now is mixing in some of the AK Magenta, probably 70-30 mix at first. We are just going to start adding in our highlights, so picking out any of the raised areas. So as you can see, it's pretty much all of this part because it's pretty much raised. Where there's a raised area, you're sort of painting around it. So imagine if you've got a millimetre thick raised area, like an edge highlight, you would paint a centimetre over that so that you can show that the highlight is larger, but then your main edge highlight is the brightest point. So right now we're probably covering about 70% of the dragon blood in this sort of 70-30 mix. Again, it's got a little drop of water in there as well, just to help with the opacity so that you can see some of that original dragon blood showing through. And all I keep doing now is I'm just adding more magenta to the mix to get my highlights showing through. So now we're probably only at about a 50-50 mix, but you can already see that we've got a nice transition from dark dragon blood up to the 50-50 mix. I'm also adding in some little lines to get the texture onto the cloak, making sure here we're edge highlighting now, picking out all those areas. I then wanted to get some desaturation onto the cloak to make it look like it's really worn through, almost threadbare. So instead of going brighter in pinks and purples, I get some AK vampiric flesh, but any very, very pale flesh colour will work, like a pallid witch flesh or a flayed one flesh, and mix that into the 50-50 mix that we already had. Just a couple of little drops is all you need to get a nice desaturated edge highlight, and then also pick out any texture that you want as well, scrapes and scratches, just to get a nice heavily worn cloak. Next up, this is sort of optional, but it adds just a bit of more colour and character to the model, where this guy is a Chaos Space Marine. I always like to add ethereal type colours to them, just to make them look like under the power of the Chaos Gods. So what I wanted to do here was, I wanted some green light reflections on his face, so that has to be coming from somewhere. So I just imagined around the gorget of his helmet would be 3 little green lights. So to achieve a bright green light, what I'm going to be doing is, first off, I'm using the AK Black Green, which is I suppose Caliban Green or Warpstone Green. And where I imagine the 3 lights to be, I'm applying paint either side of those. So where the little dot of green light would be coming from, either side of that, I've got this dark green colour, and it's pretty much the entirety of that gorget gets painted in the black green. I then apply the same now where I want to have green glowing from. I want that to be the darkest areas to be the black green, so I paint all of those areas with just pure black green now. So that's the inner part of the vent there, the vents in either side, and the vents coming out, the 4 vents at the bottom. With these really, really bright points, dark paint, so the dark is cold, and the light paint, the bright points, is the hottest. So what we're doing here, we're going from cold to hot. So the coldness is the sort of what's left over from the heat, what's emanated out, and it's the same with the light. The brightest point is the bright, and the darkest point the shadow. So now we're going to use some AK Deep Green, and I'm imagining now this is almost the point of light itself, but it's just a little bit bigger. So this is the sort of the entirety of the light bulb, and that is where we're painting in this bright deep green colour. A little dot of it is all that's really needed. You can see there, not very much at all was needed. And I'll do a little bit of dot inside one of the holes that's on the armour. And then for these vents at the back, I only cover here the sort of bottom half of where the vents are. If you can get it inside those little recesses, that's really good as well. Same with the vents, the bottom parts of the vents on either side, and the 4 vents that are in the sort of middle, just a couple of 1 dot in the bottom corner of each one, as this is acting as our sort of one of our bright points. Now's the fun part. We use some AK Intense White. Sorry if it's a little bit blurry there. And this is the center point of our bright. So this is the thing that's actually emanating our light. So tiny little dots of the white paint for the lights around his gorget. A little bit of white in that center bit there. And then on the vents on the back, just white in the bottom sections. Leaving, we're probably covering less than 5% of the area in this white. We use the white because the fluorescent paint works really well straight over white. And speaking of which, the next step is just use some AK Fluorescent Green. You have to apply this a little bit like contrast paint. It is quite thick, but it does require a little bit of practice to get this on. And all I'm doing here is I'm pushing the fluorescent green into those center white points. Might take a couple of coats, but just applies very carefully. So as you can see, they're pushing the paint into the center of those white, and it just makes it look like there's a little bright green light there, which is then pulsing some light, which will be reflected off of his face, and then on the vents it just looks like the vents are really hot, glowing with an ethereal green chaotic energy. With that, a majority of the main model itself is painted, and obviously you can use all those skills on the majority of your Chaos Space Marines. We're now going to move on to the Reave-Captain's face. For that, I'm going to be using AK Sickly Pink. I'm not sure what sort of colour you would have in the Warhammer range. You might have to get some pink horror and mix a little bit of a pallid witch flesh with it to get this. It's a really desaturated fleshy pink colour. Do need a couple of coats of this. It is thinned down, and then just apply this all over the face. Now it is good thinning this paint down, because like before we've used with even with the dragon blood or the red of the armour, when the paint is thinned down and you apply that first coat, you can still see some of the primer beneath it. But when you apply that second coat and you only do it over the raised areas, you still get some shadow areas developing. It takes a little bit of practice, and it doesn't always work, but you start to find that when you use thinned down paints, you can almost sometimes naturally get a transition from your darkest areas to your bright areas just by the more layers that you add. But generally for the heads, which is where your eyes are most drawn to first of all, getting 2 or 3 good coats on there, full coverage, is the best way forward. Once your sickly pink is dry, we then, for the flesh wash, I'm not going to be using like a Reikland flesh shade, or I sometimes use watered down AK wine red. What instead I'm going to use, because I want to have the same sort of flesh tones on the Reave-Captain as our slave at the bottom, I'm using Warhammer Carroburg Crimson, but heavily watered down. This is an extremely intense wash, probably one of their strongest that they have in their range. You could equally use Vulpes Pink as well, but again you have to water it down. It's probably 1 drop of paint to 3, 4, 5 drops of water. If you wash it down with water more, the better, because if you don't and apply too much, you have to start again, whereas you can always apply multiple coats of washes to get the effect. I apply 2 coats with this, and it's really good. It sinks into those recesses. It over the top of this sickly pink, it's got an almost Darth Vader-y type look to it, where his skin looks raw but still human. And it just gives a nicer effect than your standard flesh washes. And again, it takes 10 to 15 minutes to dry. Once it is dry, I then do what we usually do when we come to doing our highlights. We go back to the sickly pink, and I'm now just picking out the nose, any raised areas, the eyebrows, the cheeks, the chin, mouth, the ears, any areas on the very top of the head which would reflect the light. Again, I'm still using that size 0 brush, but you could go a size smaller if you weren't confident using a bigger brush. Just work around the model. The sickly pink is watered down a little bit. Try not to get too much on the brush because you could flood the areas and lose control. I then work around the model, as you've seen, using a lot of the colours we've already used before, which is the wonders of the wet palette, just to make the eye areas, these eye patch that he's got, anything metallic there, just using those non-metallic metal colours we used before, which is the sort of basalt grey and a little bit of silver grey, just to make those stand out, but not too much of a highlight because they are mostly in shadows, but it's just used to really pick those out. To get the green reflections on his face, what I imagine now is that the green light is going upwards, so the light is directed upwards under his face. So I want to pick out anything this is using watered down AK deep green, and I'm almost glazing this now downwards in those areas where I want it to catch the light. So this deep green, which is watered down, when you're pushing the paint downwards, it will pool in some of the recesses and in the areas where you want it to be brighter green. So I've not gone too bright on the face highlights, as I wanted the green to be slightly brighter than the highlights on the face. And it's a couple of washes of this, pulling the paint downwards just to get a good bit of coverage. And then with the pure deep green, I pick out a few little edge highlights where it would catch on the metal or where it would be really, really bright. I then use a tiny bit of the intense white, again just to pick out areas where it would be really, really bright, not too much. And then over that I use the AK fluorescent green, pretty much going over all of it, but making sure to pull that paint down so that it covers the highlight, and that we sort of get our sort of underglow of the green from his gorget lights, his underglow on his head itself. And one final step after I apply these minor highlights here with the sickly pink is I want to get some of those shadows back in. So I use some watered down AK Tenebrous Grey, and I just gently apply some of this into his eyes, into his mouth, and I try and add this in between the transition of the green and the flesh, just so that you get a shadow line appear, so that where one highlight finishes, the other highlight can start. But this is just picking out some of the real deep recesses on his face, some of the wrinkles in the shadow areas, just with this Tenebrous Grey. So when you pull it down darker, it means the highlights show a little bit better. And then once I've done that, I just gently prise it off the little sprue and then use some super glue to attach it. And you can see that you get the glowing from the gorget areas reflecting up onto his face, and it just nicely blends in with the rest of the model, and we get a very beaten up looking Chaos Space Marine. So the next stages are of course really from here, really optional. We've got a variety of ways in my other videos of painting weaponry and stuff. But first of all here, what I did with that slave guy was I painted him exactly the same way I painted the face. So I completely painted him in sickly pink. It was about 3 coats of sickly pink. I then did a wash of the Carroburg crimson that was watered down. I then did another wash over the top of that of watered down Reichlin flesh shade. And here I'm now just going to apply a highlight of the sickly pink, which has been watered down, just to create some texture and highlight the fleshy areas. So it's pretty much the same principles as when we painted the face, but it was just the inclusion of some Reichlin flesh shade, because I just wanted to get some extra definition in the recesses and darken down the pinkness, and the flesh shade make him look a little bit dirtier. And much like the other parts of the Space Marine, for our little slave guy, we use the same colours. So for the leather work, it's grim brown, leather brown, saddle brown. That's the highest point we go to, is with the saddle brown. And then for his metal chains, just use the sort of Tenebrous Grey, Basalt Grey, and a little bit of Silver Grey to get the silver effect for his metal chains. Now we're gonna, once he's painted, we're gonna move on to doing his sword effects and a sort of dirty glow from his plasma pistol. So I'm going to be using some AK Intense White, and then in that technical contrast medium pot is a mix. It's Vallejo white ink, contrast medium, and water. It's a 1:1:1 ratio. So 1 part white ink, 1 part water, 1 part contrast medium. You could mix that in a little pot yourself, but what I decided to do was make a big pot of it and then pour it into the contrast medium pot. What you're making really is a white contrast paint, which works in the same way, where the bright white will pool in the recesses, which is really good for plasma glows, because what that means is it will just naturally pool around inside those coils. takes about 10-15 minutes to dry, and you need a couple of layers to get a nice intense whiteness. But because of that, it means you can play with it, so you can get nice transitions from your first coat down into pure white. I also then use it just around the power nodes, because then it nicely paints the power node itself a little bit, but as I said, it pulls around each side of the node, so you get some pureness around the edges. I then move to some AK Intense White, and I edge highlight the entire sword, all of the edges. I then add, with some thinned down white, I add some lightning crackles coming out of the power node itself. Very, very subtle, but they're there. I also then want to paint the sort of smoke coming from the plasma pistol. That's a bit from Epic Basing. So the slave itself was from Deadly Print Studios, the 3D bit. You can buy the STLs or you can buy the 3D bits themselves. And that smoke effect was from Epic Basing. Again, you can buy the STLs or you can buy the bits from them. Both are amazing quality. They're two of the best companies I've found for basing bits. They offer all different sizes, different styles, and they work really well with these Warhammer miniatures. But yeah, just paint the smoke in pure white. So once that's done, it's airbrushing time. You could do this with a dry brush, but I just preferred using the airbrush. It's so a bit more control over it. So I use some Vallejo white ink, and as you can see there, I've got a cheap Fengda Airbrush from Amazon. It cost me £30, 0.04 nozzle, and I just find I get some really great effects with it. I've got expensive airbrushes, I don't use them. I prefer this one. It does what I want, and gives me some really great effects. So what I'm doing here is I use the white ink now to get our halo transitions around the model to show the light reflections and the heat reflections. So point the nozzle to the center point of where you want that glow to be, and then do a couple of sprays, because then the airbrush will naturally halo around that area and give you a transition point. So here I'm aiming at the bottom part of the coils, spraying downwards. On the sword I paint the sort of power nodes in the center point, a couple of sprays there, then I do a couple of sprays at the very tip just to get some transition. As I said before, the fluorescent paints work well over white, so when you have a transition of pure white and then those halos down, you'll get a really nice transitional point from your fluorescent colours to your dark colours. Take your time when using the ink through the airbrush. It's very thin, short, sharp sprays. I really recommend having a cheap model from eBay, like a Rhino or something like that. It's a very cheap model, or some MDF sheets or some paper, and just doing some practices with your airbrush. There are many videos out there on how to use an airbrush. I won't go into the technicalities of it, as I can't profess to know everything. I just know how I use it work. And what I'm doing here is I want some of the plasma glow to be reflecting onto our little slave guy. So I just do a couple of sprays down onto his top left, as that's where the light would be reflecting from. So now I'm using some AK Fluorescent Magenta, a little drop of water in there as well, because it does help flow. And then I'm just very carefully spraying over all of the white that we've just done, plus a little bit of the surrounding area with the magenta. It takes a few coats, take your time, don't rush it, otherwise it will just flood the area and it will look absolutely terrible. A few sprays here and there, a few coats to get a nice glowing pink effect. Get the darkness of the smoke, I just mix in some AK Tenebrous Grey into the magenta that we've already used, and then just spray that downwards on the smoke, so that you'll get the magenta will still be underneath as the hot point, and the Tenebrous Grey will be acting as the cold point on the top parts of the smoke, giving a nice smoke effect. So always use the angle, holding your model and the nozzle at different angles to get the effects that you want to do. So yeah, for the smoke, I'm pointing the airbrush downwards, so the paint flows over the top of the smoke, giving us nice transitions from the very, very bright to the very, very dark. Then back to our little magical mix of white ink, contrast and water, and I just apply this now into the bottom parts of the coil. This is where I want it to be really, really hot. So just the bottom parts of the coil, I add this to, and in the sort of the gun nozzle, a little bit in there, a little bit on the smoke, and just a few spots around the sword as well, where I want it to be some of the most brightest. And once that's dry, I just go over those with some AK Fluorescent Orange. So I wanted this to have, as I said before, so a really weird, ethereally, chaotic-y type look. And I find that a highlight to magenta being orange gives that really weird, magical, evil kind of look to it. If you wanted to just go into a brighter magenta, you could just use this white and then go over the top of it with your AK Magenta again to really push it. Or you can buy an enamel paint from the Wargaming range, which is Fluor Magenta enamel, which I've used in a couple of videos previous to that, which really, really pops the fluorescent colour. But just using the white and then going over it with AK Magenta will in itself give you a nice bright highlight. I then just do some non-metallic metal, just some silver onto the gun just to give it some highlights. And I then glue the whole model onto the base itself using some super glue. I use the Green Stuff World cyanocrylate adhesive. It's really good, you don't need a lot of it, and it dries pretty quick. So there we go, there's our full model on. I added a couple of grass tufts just before I do my basing. A few people have asked how I do my basing. This is how I've been doing it recently to get a nice dirty, rusty, filthy look on the base. So over the entire model, I water down some AK Grim Brown, and over the entire base area I just chuck it on, basically taking care not to get any over the main model itself. I just paint this all over the base. That's AK Grim Brown to get the look that this colour is over the model, so that the dirt and that's running over the model. I water the paint down even more and then just wash it over the areas where I want it to look like the dirt is over, so the feet, the bottom parts of the armour, a little bit on his cloak, just to give a little bit of that colour and dustiness reflecting back off of the model itself. It just helps seat the model on the base. I also apply a little bit over our little slave guy as well. Once that's dry, I then use some dirty down acrylic rust, which is basically, for me, it's rust in a pot. It works with water as well. This is a water-based product. They've got some videos and guides on their website, but all I do is I dip the brush in, pick up some of the rust itself, then get some water and just smooth it all out with some water. And what this will do is it leaves rust deposits on the model, and over a period of about 10-15 minutes as it's drying, it gets orangier and orangier. So you get dirty looking rust, bright orangey looking rust, a nice sort of mix between the two dependent on how you apply it. Straight out of the pot it's going to be dark and dirty. Add a bit more water, it gets brighter orangier to show newer, wetter rust. I also apply a little bit of fluorescent orange, so the AK fluorescent orange that we were using, I apply a little bit of that as well to certain areas to really help boost the oranginess of the rust, which I've done a couple of times on other models on some other videos where I use fluorescent orange as our brightest rust colour. As I said, it takes 10 to 15 minutes to dry, sometimes a little bit longer, depending on how thick you've done it and how much water you've applied. I then just, on some areas, just do a dry brush of AK Light Earth, and that is how I do my bases. You can do, if you've got a bigger area, you can do Grim Brown and then dry brushes of AK Mud Brown and AK Light Earth, and then apply this dirty down rust over it, because you'll get some natural transitions as well happening there. They also do a verdigris, which is also very good. I'm probably going to use that in my next video. Here I just do some dry brushing with some Tenebrous Grey just to get some of those shadows coming in dark areas on the plasma glows. I then paint the rim of the model in Army Painter's matte black. And there he is. There's our Red Corsairs Reave-Captain, all finished. You can use these principles on any of your Red Corsairs model, on your Chaos Space Marines, on Blood Angels, on anything that's red or black, got dark metallics and golds, that you want a different look when you're painting the skin tones, but only using one colour really with a wash, and how to get some really good chaotic looking weaponry effects. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. As always, like, comment and subscribe, and happy painting, my fellow painters.